And I'm glad that all of that was caught on the recording thing for this lecture.
Yeah.
Hey. Do you mind if I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Just go.
Sounds good. Let's see if we can solve this before this one. So oddly enough, I'm trying to put the team names, right? And this is what I'm getting. It's splitting up into like.
Oh, you're just getting the first letter.
Yeah.
So it's somehow.
So this is what I have here. So I've just selected the rows, right? And then right here is where I try to start, and you get.
I wonder.
And then then right here I'm returning D.
That might be too weird though that you're getting the first. Somehow it's acting
like an array of letters, basically.
It's treating it like an array of letters. So table looks like
Name of the same name. It demonstrates how.
Can you?
So this is the same, but
Oh, it's him. Okay.
yeah. So no, it's fine.
So can
What
you?
should I try?
So can you try this console in D and just see if it's giving you the first line for some reason?
Yeah, should I just instead of return, should I just console D? Will that
Maybe
work?
try just instead of a function of D, maybe try just because this should already have
Yeah.
text in it. Like maybe try just return just text would be
What would be an E? Just D.
maybe.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's gonna be
Try that.
no.
No, since D is not defined.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. So where's the data that?
Correct.
Is this out table elements?
Yeah. Which I basically just set equal to team data for now.
And so data d.key. Oh, sorry. Shouldn't make any difference with an arrow function, but would you try?
Okay, go ahead. It's yeah.
Okay, cool. D, just D. I'm just wondering.
No, then that's what it is.
Yeah. So, how wide are these? Is it?
It's making it the length of the key.
Mm-hmm.
So is it an issue right here?
It could be. So
Okay.
instead of using this, could you try using I'm trying to think that instead of D key where is that? It's like
Let's try that.
Is this key?
Oh, and just return D.
It's still doing that.
It could also be the way I'm appending the header. I don't know. I'm just
Yeah.
a little lost right now,
So can you go to the console? I might have to.
yeah, that's fine.
But if you go to try just figuring out exactly what's being bound to your TDs.
Okay.
Because it could be like how you're passing the text that shouldn't be wrong.
Yeah.
But it might just be what you're passing to like your TD, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
I'll try that later.
We have the other.
Okay, so welcome back. Today we'll be wrapping up the lecture on views, which is also the last thing that will be on the test on Thursday, and then I will start talking about how do we actually design visualizations, what's the process, how do we do like a task analysis, what are tasks and so on. And then we'll talk also a little bit about design methodology, like how can we actually come up with creative designs. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about evaluation if we get there. But before that, I will take any questions you have about the exam. Yeah.
Is there a focus on the theory section, or should we expect to see virtually everything we covered in theory this far?
You should expect to see, like, basically a selection of questions from all topics, and there will be, as I mentioned, there will be both theory and some coding questions. So, like, I'm not going to ask you how do I set this and that force in force directed layout in D3, but you should definitely understand like the difference between enter and update and exit and these kinds of things. So, yeah. I haven't compiled it yet, but probably like 6 to 8. There will be one more for grad students. Yeah.
So is a date considered interval?
A date, I would say yes. It's like dates really are the 0 point. Like if you say it's October 2nd, 2018, right? This is a number that is in reference to an arbitrary 0 point. Time generally not, right? If you have like something meaningful like time elapsed since this lecture started, that's a ratio data set.
But for example, that example about 15 meters race time.
Yes.
So the 0 would be like
The
one
start of the race.
Okay.
So that's like a meaningful point, right? So the 0 means like it took me twice as much to run 50 meters than it took me 25 meters. Time is meaningful here, like multiplication is meaningful, and therefore this operation is defined, and so on. But, yeah.
I still don't understand how we know the 0.
So think about is 0, like if there is 0, think of is there none of that yet? Like if you think of time, if you say time since the race started, it's 25 seconds, and then let's say at 0, the race hasn't started yet. But if you say year 0, there of course has been time since then. But if you are more specific at years since like the birth of Jesus Christ, if that's going to be a reference point, then it's a ratio scale. So it depends on your interpretation in these cases. Other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned there's an extra question for grad students. What's that question? Is it more of a theory question?
It's going to be about the papers.
Papers.
Yes.
The 2 papers that we
Yes. And again, I'm not going to ask some subtle detail. I'm going to ask about like the big ideas in the paper. It's closed book. Make sure you're on time. Yeah. So, and it's not supposed to like put you under pressure time-wise, so you don't have to worry about that. Yeah.
What does the mechanical Turk research paper have to do with visualization?
Well, you will see more about that today. The Mechanical Turk research paper had a couple of studies. Like basically, we talked about this in the context of graphical perception, right? And the study that they actually ran was about graphical perception, which is of course the core visualization topic. But the premise of the paper at large is actually evaluating whether Mechanical Turk is a suitable method to evaluate visualization techniques. And so it's a method, and we'll talk about other methods today. This is actually the last part of the section, the last part of the second part of the lecture. Okay, and as I already mentioned, there's going to be a critique and redesign question as well. Okay, so last time we talked about views. And so let's quickly review what we talked about views. So we had this principle of like, this whole lecture is about how we use multiple visualization idioms or visualization techniques next to each other to understand something better than before. And this is kind of this principle, eyes of a memory, to trade off display space and working memory. And we talked about that multiple views are like a great solution for many problems if we have like a large screen, like a laptop or bigger. But of course, if you have only like a small handheld device, then multiple views might not be the right kind of approach. And we talked about these kind of different principles of how can multiple views be structured, whether they have shared encoding, whether they share data, whether they share navigation. And so yeah, let's go over this. Linked views are multiple views that are simultaneously visible and linked together such that action in one view affect the others. And so we've had examples for highlighting and for navigation. And the other two options here are encoding and data set. So highlighting is really about, like, if I click on item A, and item A is represented in two different views, will it be highlighted in both views so that I can see a particular item or a particular group of items in multiple views. Navigation is really about whether I have like one view, for example, that is in detail, and the other one is separate, and whether I could like navigate in those views and have like linked navigation between those views. Same or multiform encoding. Can anybody remember what multiform encoding is? So multiform encoding is about choosing a different visual encoding for the same or part of the same data set. And that can be useful in different scenarios because different visualization techniques are good at certain tasks, or we can also do like an overview and detail approach like that. And the data set is share, subset, or none. Of course, none is not particularly interesting. And so this was a simple example of linked highlighting. So we have some geospatial, a geospatial plot, and then two plots with attributes that show this in scatter plots. And here we highlighted the area on the west coast of the US and see where those points are in these other two plots. This was a more complex example where we have essentially like statistics, like facets into different areas for companies. Like this is a general purpose visualization technique, but the example here is different aspects of companies like industries, number of workers, growth, revenue, which state they're in, and then those specific items. And I can hover over any of those like facets or bars and then see how this distributes across all others. And so multiform, as I already mentioned, is a different visual encoding between two views. And so this is one example from our homework 6 that we'll be publishing soon, where we have the same data represented in two different ways, right? So once we have up here this bar chart, this stacked bar chart of electoral votes, and then we have down here the same data encoded in a geospatial approximation on a map. So these two views essentially have share most of the same data, but they give us different they answer different questions, right? The top one answers who won the election by simply stacking up the blue or red squares. The bottom one answers which region did vote how. So different questions, essentially the same data. Here's another example that we had, where we had a node link diagram and a matrix diagram showing the same network. And a similar example here. We talked about overview plus detail, where one view shows often summarized information about the entire data set, while additional views show more detailed information about the subset. The simplest example for that was what? There's a tooltip would be a very simple example, right? But you could have a separate view where you show details about a selected item more information in a separate view. So here is another example of having an overview plus detail. This is a stacked zooming technique. So here at the top we have a long timeline, and then we have two zoom views, the blue and the yellow one, and then in those two zoom views we have more zoom views. And so here basically we're breaking this down from maybe a yearly line chart of stock prices to like an intraday chart by having these multiple zoom levels. Here was a couple of other examples that we talked about. One important technique is small multiples. In small multiples, each view uses the same visual encoding, but shows a different subset of the data. And the idea here is to be able to compare different parts of a data set and therefore relying on eyes instead of memory. And a classical example of doing that is if we want to analyze the network, but not only the structure of the network, but also the attributes of the network. And so how do we actually encode, let's say, this is a gene regulatory network, and we have 5 different tissue samples that we measured, and we want to understand for each of these 5 samples what the attributes associated with each node are. And so the simple solution here is to simply plot the same network, the same topology, the same graph, in this case 6 times, and just use a different color encoding on top of that network to show you us the differences between the different samples. So here we can see for like that this node here is green in this experiment, yellow in this experiment, and then yellow in those top 2 experiments. And here we have a cluster mostly red, but then here other points are red. So we can kind of like spot those differences efficiently. I also mentioned that there's a couple of problems with the technique. Can you remember what those are? Yeah.
Number one problem would be resolution, right? Because the more times you split a view, the less space you have to work with.
Exactly. So we have a trade-off of resolution versus the number of multiples we show. And so a common approach to deal with that is to have like one view that is zoomed in where you can actually read labels in addition to the small multiples. And then also we talked about small multiples. Sometimes just like a completely different approach is useful. For example, in the fertility case that we discussed, where we had Japanese and American historical fertility. Okay, and so we stopped basically when we were talking about partitioning. And partitioning is a very powerful tool. Partitioning is about separating data into groups. And so you have a couple of design choices when you partition a data set. Like how do you divide the data up between views? Maybe given a hierarchy of attributes, how many splits do you want to make? What is the order of splits? How many views do you want to create? Which is a question that's usually data-driven. And which attributes are you using to partition? And so obvious attributes to partition on would be categorical, but you could also bin numerical data. So, for example, if we have a data set of soccer players, and we want to look at who scored how many goals, what could be like a categorical attribute that we could partition on? Position, yes. So that would make a lot of sense, right? Because we want to compare like strikers with strikers and not strikers with goalies. And so that brings in a lot of context. You could also try to answer the question whether like left-handed or like left-footed or right-footed people or both-footed people are better. So we could partition based on their preferred foot that they use to shoot. So here was an example of how we partition, how we can partition. This is like a demographic distribution in some states. And we have 2 categories at the same time, the states and these age bins. In this case here, it's partitioned only by state. In this case here, it's partitioned by both group and state. And those answer different questions. As always, like which of those is better depends on the task. This is a simple partition by category where we have this iris data set that is well known for machine learning, like the iris toy data set. And this is separated by these 3 different species here. And then we talked about Trellis Plots, which are kind of like just a formal way or like a specific way of thinking about these partitions. So in the Trellis Plot, we have different panel variables, we have partitioning variables, and we have also what's called main effects ordering. So if we look at this more closely here, we have barley yields in 2 years across multiple farms for multiple barley strains. So the 2 years are what partitions them left and right. The farms are what partitions these big blocks horizontally, vertically. Then we have the strains partitioned within each of those groups. And so this kind of gives us a neat overview of this data. But we can also choose to, for example, not partition one of those two data sets. And so partitioning is essentially when we partition, we use space to encode, we use position to encode this categorical variable, separate out by categorical variable. In this case here, we have replaced that space encoding with a color encoding, right? And so here we see 1932 compared to 1931, and that looks a lot like the soccer table that you guys implemented, or are implementing actually. You can do this division recursively. We'll talk more about the specific technique, tree maps, but essentially we can flexibly transform data attributes into a hierarchy. So here, for example, we have a map of the stock market, and so this is partitioned by market segments first, and then it's partitioned by the companies. But we could think of like additional parameters to partition this for each market segment. We could also partition in profitable or not profitable companies, for example. So we can like nest this deeper and deeper. And so here's an example of London property being partitioned. Like we have a data set of property values and like associated attributes in London. And so we have like partitioning attributes are house type, flat, semi-detached, or terraced house. The neighborhood, so you can see that within the second level, within the flat category, we have now neighborhoods like Sutton, Croydon, Kingston, and so on. And then sale time. So within those small neighborhood rectangles, we have actually partitioned it also by sale time. Then there's a choice of encoding attributes. The average price here is encoded by color, and the number of sales in the particular area are shown as size. And so what we can do then is compare between neighborhoods, look at different housing distribution, and within neighborhood we can also see that there are similar prices or where there are outliers. And of course it makes more sense to compare like the flats being sold in Kingston than to compare flats with terraced houses being sold in Kingston. So that does make sense. But we can also partition this in a different way. So here, this is first partitioned by neighborhood, then by house type, then by sale time year, then by sale time month. The encoding attributes here are neighborhood location by approximate position, average pricing, color, and then size isn't used in this case. And this essentially, we can see in this chart that as in most cities, like expensive neighborhoods in London cluster somewhere close to the center. So this is a video that introduces this.
Survey's 2009 paper on the same name. It demonstrates how hierarchical layouts can be used to explore multivariate data through the reconfiguration using London property transactions as an example. We run through all the figures in the paper using the notation we developed to describe their states, the operators we use to reconfigure their states, and show how this can help us address research questions. Property transactions in this view are conditioned using property type and the year of sale. Rectangles are sized by the number of sales and coloured by the average price. Almost half of all sales are flats. Since rectangles are ordered by size, temporal trends are difficult to detect. We will now reconfigure the layouts to arrange the years chronologically. This view more clearly shows the upward trend in average price. To increase the temporal granularity, we will add months to the hierarchy. We also recolour to reflect the number of sales. We call these calendar views. Years are arranged from left to right, and months from top to bottom for each year. Purple is used to show the number of sales, which appear to vary seasonally. We expect there to be spatial variation in these data, so we will now insert London Borough into the base of the hierarchy and use orange to show average price again. There are marked differences in sales, shown through size, and price, shown through colour, between boroughs, but it's difficult to see how it's varied spatially, as all the rectangles are ordered by size on the top left. We can see, however, that Wandsworth in the top left has the most sales, and the City of London has the least. The size order doesn't let us identify a spatial pattern very easily, so we now rearrange the rectangles spatially and temporally. We can now detect some spatial patterns. For example, we can see that the highest average prices tend to be central and west of the centre, and sales of flats dominate centrally, but less so peripherally. Rectangles are small where there are low sales, making it difficult to see the detail. In the next view, we fix the size of rectangles to show each with equal prominence. The detail on property types can now be resolved more easily, even where sales are low.
So I think you get what this is about. Just a comment, this was one of the most impressive conference presentations I've seen because they actually live coded the whole expressions that you saw at the bottom here during the talk. And they really gave, like most of the talk as an interactive demo while live coding. So I really like this work. Another approach, instead of like partitioning, is layering. And layering is about combining multiple views on top of one another to form a composite view. Like we saw an example earlier with this like layered trellis plot where you have the 2 years for color coded on top of that. And of course, the rationale here is that this supports a larger, more detailed view than just using multiple views, but it also introduces constraint on the visual encoding that I can use. So the choice as well as the number of layers that can be shown. So here is like a simple example, like a historical example. We can simply layer line charts that are of the same data type, of the same domain on top of each other, right? This is something very natural, and you would actually have to explicitly think about this as layering to realize it is like this. So this is imports of cotton and other things into England. And so basically we have 3 different items here over time. They're layered in one chart. Of course, there are limits to that. So here would be like a CPU utilization chart, and we can like read it reasonably well with like 4 or 5 layers. Maybe like with 20 as well, but then if we plot hundreds of them, then suddenly this isn't particularly useful anymore. So there must be better solutions. I think a more obvious example of layering is if we have dual axes. So in this case, we have both shipping cost and profit shown in one chart. So what do you think is the rationale for doing that? I couldn't hear.
Is that related?
So yes, but like, okay, the assumption is they could be related, right? And so we want to test that and plot them on top of each other. And then we can do something like that, and I think that the visualization designer here has made a good choice by showing like the profit as bar charts and the shipping costs as line charts because they're different, right? So we can clearly tell that they're maybe not of the same scale, and we can see those 2 scales here. But generally, using 2 scales in the same chart can be quite tricky. And so that's something where you really need to evaluate whether that's a good design choice. And another risk, of course, is that like this implies correlation, and we can actually find a lot of correlation if we just look hard enough. Here we have dual axis. Number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in terms of like, you see like we have like 100 drownings, 120 drownings, and then 2, 3, and 4 films. And so just by like rescaling appropriately, we can actually find correlations and show trends where there are none. So this is actually from a website. I think put the link into the slides, but it's like a website of various correlations or something like that. You can of course also combine partitioning and layering, so to kind of like use benefits of both of them. So here we have like a data set where we have these time series charts partitioned like vertically and horizontally, but then we also have layered these values at the bottom. So this gives us like an overview of the trends in these layer charts, but then we can inspect them in detail and understand, in this case, also the hierarchy on the left in the center chart. And then, like here, we are using synchronous highlighting to show relationships. And then you can actually take these multiple coordinated view approaches like very far. So you can essentially mash up visualization techniques and show relationships. So what I'm showing you here is like a categorical visualization. Like this is a data set about artists. So here we have a categorical definition of either female, or group, or male. Then we have the origin separated. Then we have their hits over time. This is what the matrix shows us. The number of studio albums, when they published their first album, then the start of the career, the career status, a number of years in business, separated for inactive and active, and so on. So this visualization is actually created through like a prototype and is interactively created.
So it's an interactive visualization technique for main domain interface. Block browser shows a list of all loaded data subsets. Domino distinguishes between three block types. Partition blocks show categorical data like gender. Numerical blocks show numerical data such as the release year of the first album. And matrix blocks show item combinations like the count of #1 hits for each artist in different countries. Relationships are represented in different granularities and directions using lines and bands. Placeholders and live previews help to add new blocks. When dragging an element from the block browser onto the board, possible draw positions are indicated. When entering the placeholder, a live preview of the data is shown. By dropping the item, the selection is confirmed. Domino allows users to quickly create advanced setups. Blocks can be added. Visualization types can be switched.
Okay, so I think you get the idea. So this is really like basically here, this is an interface where you can like choose to dynamically partition based on a categorical variable or not. And if you don't partition, then you can show relationships between multiple views using these links here. Okay, so this is it about views, and this is also everything that you need to know for the exams. Any questions? Okay, so then let's move on and talk a little bit about Okay, so let's start with tasks and design. And so, like more generally, like taking one step back, when we develop a visualization technique, there's two different approaches to do that. There's either the problem-driven or the technique or idea-driven approach. And the problem-driven approach is when, like, I think the most sensible approach in most practical situations, right? You go out and try to understand the problem that somebody has with data analysis. And then you design a solution to help these users or these analysts to work more efficiently. And in the academic field, this is sometimes called the design study. In the contrast to that is kind of like this technique-driven or idea-driven approach. There's a kind of a bottom-up approach. For example, I could say, I had this cool new idea to improve force-directed layouts or to improve node-link layouts in general. And then you would just develop that and then find the problem maybe where you can show that it's useful. And both approaches are like valid, but usually like in the industry, clearly you will like be faced with the problem-driven approach mostly. And so we will be actually talking mostly about how we can design for these problem-driven approaches. So now this was a mandatory reading a while ago for the last lecture, and we didn't get to this. But now I wanted to discuss this paper. So, anybody want to summarize what this paper was about? Yeah.
It's kind of a framework for methodology for design, starting with a kind of abstract layer and a four-tiered model. I can't remember there on top of my head. Let's see. Starting with defining the domain problem, then you work into data, then you work into encoding, you work into algorithms. Basically, each step you got to start to understand a step before you go to the next step, so that you ensure that the end product is meaningful for what it was designed for.
Yeah, exactly. So the basic idea, this was a great summary, thank you. The basic idea of this is to really tease apart different aspects of problem-driven visualization design. Because like one danger, if you're like a visualization designer, is that you have like your favorite technique, and then you find a problem, and somehow you can imagine, maybe I can fit the data to my visualization technique. But then you're doing something wrong because you haven't asked the question of what is the actual problem that you're trying to solve, and you have maybe not thought about what data transformation or data abstraction do I have to do to actually answer those questions. You have more thought about what are the data transformations that I need to do to fit it to my tool, right? And then eventually, when you choose a visual encoding, you also need to worry about whether this can actually be implemented. And this is like if you have a big data set and you have a complex layout, that might actually be like a performance bottleneck, or you might not have enough screen space, or any of these problems. And so let's talk about these individual blocks for a second. Yeah. So what is domain problem characterization about? Like if you think of it from a software engineering point of view, this is really like the software requirement elicitation, right? We want to understand what are the needs and wants and what are the problems in the domain. What could data operation or abstraction design be? It's been a long time since you read this paper. Okay. Well, data operation or abstraction design is like very often like the question, a useful idea to think about is like a research question often cannot be answered directly, right? For example, if you talk to biologists and they want to essentially identify a gene that is a potential target for a cancer drug. Let's say this is the research question. Is it obvious which data we need to collect to evaluate that question? So no, it really, this is all about the experimental design. What data do we need to collect? How do we need to transform this data to make any kind of assumption? So easier question, what is encoding interaction technique design here? So this is all about, yeah.
Like what kind of charts or graphs would like fit the data well?
Exactly. Not only the data, but also the question, right? So which kind of chart or graph does fit both the data set that we have and the question. And then finally, algorithm design is all about what do we need to do to make this actually work in practice? Like what is the algorithm that we need to run? And so the second part of this paper, I think this is a useful model, generally, to think about if you design an application that tries to fit, that tries to help somebody, that is a useful model just to think about. But this paper has another part to it, and that's about validity. Anybody want to talk about that? Yeah.
Well, so there's two different parts, right? You have whether you made the right thing and whether it actually works. This is verification and validation, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Part of it, yes.
Okay.
So essentially, like it's all about validation. And so why is this model, this 4-stage model, useful for validation? Because I can actually.
I was just going to say at each step we can check and see if we actually made the right thing and if it actually does what we expected.
Exactly. So we can, like, it's hard to say, just to validate like a complex system as one thing, right? But breaking this down into those 4 stages actually helps us to understand, have we made the right choices at each of those steps? And ideally, this model contains like validation steps before we actually do something or like go downstream, and then validation steps that we can only apply after we've implemented something. So let me see where I have this here. So here's this figure. So on each of these stages, we have a thread to validity, and then we have a description of a way to validate it, either before we go downstream or after we have actually implemented everything downstream. So the thread on the domain problem characterization level is that we have like identified the wrong problem, and that could be wrong for many different reasons, right? The validation here would be to be very careful about target users, to like observe them and not simply trust what they're saying they want to, but actually like learn more about their environment. And you will see that like these like pre-implementation validation steps are usually much more informal, but then after we have done something, we can actually more formally validate something. The bad data operation abstraction, we don't actually have a great way to validate that before we go downstream. Then the encoding interaction technique design, here we have the thread of using an inefficient encoding or interaction technique, and that is really like the reason how we can approach the validation at this point is by simply using theory, right? We can say like the most important aspect in our data set is encoded with the proper channels, and so we can kind of like validate by argument in this case. The slow algorithm would be a threat to the algorithm design. We can validate that before analyzing it by analyzing the algorithmic complexity of our algorithms. And then after we've implemented it, we can then measure how well it performs in practice. On the encoding interaction technique design stack, we can actually do qualitative or quantitative result analysis. We can test on like arbitrary users. It doesn't have to be like the domain experts, because we are actually only validating the visual encoding and not the fitness for the domain. We could run like a lab study and measure human performance or errors or anything like that. On the operator, on the data operation abstraction design level, we can test it on target users and collect anecdotal evidence for its utility. So I've had many examples where people said, wow, I could never have found this without using your tool, right? And this is an example of validation at the operator level. More formally, you could run like a field study. You could deploy this and observe over a long time and document human usage of the deployed system. And then finally, on the problem characterization level, this is a little, let's say, less formal, but you could observe adoption rates. Like, have you actually picked a problem that's relevant? If so, many other people might actually use your tool. So this is a very useful way to think about designing visualization and identifying these threats to validity. So the purpose of the nested really model is capture design decisions and think about design decisions and justify them to yourself, and to also analyze aspects of the design process. So we have those 4 different concerns, and we can separate this easily, and we can validate early and often, and therefore avoid making ineffective solutions. So this is kind of like that personal figure of like how I like to think of the design process here, like how I would apply this nested model. So first, it's about understanding the domain problem, then mapping your domain tasks to abstract tasks, and then you bring in data types and other factors, and then finally identify a suitable technique. That's a process that I find useful to think about. Now I want to talk a little bit more about each of those stages. The domain characterization stage is really the details of an application domain. Like that could be about a group of users, about a target domain, like more broadly, about their question and their data. And the thing is, this is always extremely unique. This varies wildly by domain and even by lab or by individual collaborator. But of course, the outcome here must be specific enough to continue with the project. And one key flaw, or one key problem that you have when you talk for the first time to a potential collaborator is you cannot just ask them what visualization they want. Because usually they actually don't know and they're limited by their knowledge of what visualizations are out there, right? So it's much better as a visualization designer to go out there and ask, like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And then reverse engineer from there what could be done. And so this introspection, if you're in the domain, like very often, like people don't explicitly think about, like they know exactly what question they're trying to answer and what, for example, their data is that they use to answer that, but they don't usually articulate it because they just are so immersed in this domain. And so there is an infinite number of domain tasks. Like there is like any researcher or any like analyst for whatever company or any organization will have different domain problems. But the key here is that they can be broken down into simpler abstract tasks. And once we've done that, once we've mapped this problem of identifying varying gene expression is actually a comparison task for tablet data, then we have a better handle on what solutions are there for that problem. So identifying the data and task combination will point you at the right solution for a problem. So here's an example that is based on one of on Mariah Meyer's book. Let's say I want to identify good movies in genres alike. So the domain here would be like a pretty broad general population, every like new movie enthusiast. So how could I do that? What's a good movie? Who wants to define a good movie?
You have to have the user input what genres they like first, right?
Yes, that's clearly important, but like say, do you think everybody agrees that this horror movie is better than the other?
No.
So what if I want to like build a visualization tool to like show me the good movies for a genre? Yeah.
Go through Rotten Tomatoes and just see the different.
So Rotten Tomatoes would be one option. We could look at what critics think.
We would have to define what good actually means. Does good mean number of times it's been viewed, or number of people who have viewed it, or does it mean like what critics think? We'd have to explore that.
Yes.
I think also the question is that they haven't done enough user study, because I can see good movies like, well, what are you doing with this? Because I think the obvious thing maybe is like, well, maybe I want to find good movies that I would want to watch in the future. But it could also just be that, I don't know, I have some genres I like and I want to point out to people, these are like the best movies in the genre that you should go check out. Those are two really different.
Exactly. So like it depends on the narrower task. So we would have to work more on our domain characterization. Yes, that's a very good point. You had a comment?
Oh, I just gotta say, like top grossing movies instead of IMDb and whatnot.
Yes. So the question here is really like the data task abstraction that we do next. And so when we ask the what and why and map this into generalized terms, identify the task, like you said. What is the task that we actually want to deal with? Do I want to like find good movies that I could watch next? Maybe I want to exclude all of those that I've already seen. And then find data types and a good model of the data. And I think that's going to be tricky here, right? Because good is so subjective. What do you use as like a proxy for good? And so sometimes we must transform the data to have a better solution. So we could use like Rotten Tomatoes, but then you maybe also want to like say, hey, I don't trust critics. I also want to get a little bit of a sense of what the audience thinks, and I might want to get a little bit of a sense of how popular a movie it was for my definition of good. So, what is this good movie? Highly rated by critics, rated by audience, successful in the box office, similar to movies I liked. That could be a measure for goodness, right? Or only specific genres. Where could I get the data? I could get it from IMDb, I could get it from Rotten Tomatoes, and there might be other sources out there. And this is really what this stage is about. And I need to make those decisions, and I need to also accept that this is not going to answer the precise question, right? There is no perfect answer to the precise question, what is a good movie for me? I just have to come up with a proxy that can reasonably give us an idea of what the question is. So the encodings and interactions design is the next step. Here we choose which idioms or visualization techniques or interaction techniques we apply. And this is all about ways to create and manipulate the visualization, the visual representation of the data. And of course, these decisions may be quite intertwined or might be separate. And here is where like the visualization design principles that we talked about a lot should drive your decisions. And so here's one example for like that I could just pick for this find good movie task. I say I want a combination of an audience rating and critics rating. Well, so the decision I made in the previous step, filtered by genre, and I will choose an idiom like a stacked bar chart for ratings, like a sum, an average, or a weighted sum of critics ratings and audience ratings to rank them in a list. So that would be like one choice, and then I could have like a filter interface for genre. I actually didn't have this data set, but like here, this shows a similar data set, in this case university rankings, two different aspects of university rankings, and then like our genre could be, in this case, the country. So that would be one choice that I made, right? But this is not the perfect answer to the question about good movies, but it's probably a justifiable answer, right? And so I can make a case that this is a reasonable design for that problem. This is a little bit more complex example. So if we have a domain task, when we have, the question would be control the data quality for gene splicing data. So if you collect splicing data on a human genome, for example, and this is actually from one of my papers, you can actually, like here we broke out the domain goals. Like these are the domain goals: explore differences between samples and groups, discover novel isoforms, and control data quality. And so now here I'm trying to break down what does control data quality mean for this data set. And it turns out like the things that are involved here is to judge the magnitude of a sample, compare samples, and compare groups. And these are kind of like the broken down tasks for this much higher level domain task. And then down here is the visualization technique that we designed to answer these questions. But I don't want to go too much into details. So now it's time to think a little bit more about these like abstract tasks. So we've talked about these broad domain, these specific domain tasks, like for example, what is identify good movies. But now I want to break this down into like more abstract tasks that we could use in visualization. And so on a high level, we have these like three categories: analyze, search, and query. And this seems a little abstract, but bear with me and you'll see where I'm trying to go with this. The high-level analyze actions are, do I want to consume a data set? And either do I want to discover something new, or do I want to present a data set? So this is this space between like exploratory and communication, right? Is that what is my goal here? Or is it just for fun, for enjoyment? And the produce is a little bit like more abstract. I would say like annotation, recording, and deriving. I'm going to skip over this for now. Mid-level action is what you would usually think about tasks. So for example, search, we would have like what does it depends on what the user knows. So for example, if we know the target or if we know the location. So if we know the target and the location of an item, we can just look it up. If we don't know the target, but know roughly the location, we can browse to find it. If we know the target but don't know the location, it's about locating the item in the data set. And if we don't know the target and we don't know the location, then it's about exploring the data set. Then for querying, like it's really about like identifying individual items, comparing items, or summarizing a set of items. These are these high-level tasks and queries. Here's like an example for comparing and also for deriving. So here I have like a comparison of this. The point of this chart is to show how bad the financial crisis was for Greece. And so this shows us percentage of GDP relative to a fixed point. And so we have here layered on top of each other the curve for Greece, the Euro area, Britain, and the United States. But interestingly, not the United States in 2008, but the United States Great Recession of 1929. So here we can compare how the Great Recession of 1929 impacted for the US and how difficult that is now or was then for Greece in comparison. And then here we have a derive operation. This just shows us the change on a year earlier. So this is like it's actually not an operation, but this is a derived data set. So this is kind of the same data, but just in terms of instead of in absolute values, we visualize the change. Low-level tasks is all about targets. So if we look at all the data, we want to identify trends, we want to identify outliers, or we want to identify features. And if you look at attributes, it depends on, do we want to look at one or many? So is it either about, do you want to see the distribution of one attribute, or do you want to see the extremes of one attribute? And if we have many, we want to see dependency between attributes, correlations, or similarities. And then there is specific tasks for network data and spatial data. For network data, is what is the topology, what is the connectivity in my network, and what are the paths in my network. For spatial data, it will be what is the shape. So here's an example for trends. How did the overall job market develop since the recession? And so here we can look at outliers, and we can look at trends as tasks. So this is a storytelling interface actually. So here, like we see like some trends, or generally we see that this is kind of like a mixed bag, right? There's some improvement in some jobs, and so we get like a detail on demand if we hover over an area. But we can quickly identify like trends and outliers if we scroll through a chart like this. So for example, here we have contractors for new homes are like outliers in the negative sense, right? And it's not particularly surprising because it was mostly a real estate crisis, and so therefore the contractors are negative outliers here. Or all of these like land subdivision, for sale home builders, architectural services, and so on. All of these are like negative outliers that are quickly to identify. And so we see both outliers and the trend for a particular segment of the market. So now I want to do an exercise, a task abstraction exercise. And this is like a little bit of a complex task, but I've tried to articulate it, and you'll get a handout about it. So you've been approached by geneticists to help with the visualization problem. Here's gene expression data that measures the activity of the genes for 30 cancer tissue samples. She's applied an experimental drug to see whether the cancer tissue dies as she hopes, but she finds that only some samples show the desired effect. She believes the difference between the samples caused by differential expressions, different activities of genes in a particular pathway. So this is like about the interaction of the network of genes. And she would like to understand which genes are likely to cause the difference and what role they play in the pathway. So this is the domain description now. And I want you to do the task abstraction first, and then design the visual encodings that can address this domain description. And this is a lot of text, and that's why this is printed out for you. And there's also some more notes about the data on here. So I'll give you 15 minutes to do that.
Anybody missing? We good? All right. No, we would move. Yeah. Wait.
For the G, for the sake of I think it's different G. So, all from the one specific.
Yeah, so we have a set of issues, right? Each of them has different genes in a particular way. Okay, so if you like to understand the genes, so how can we divide the thing, break down the domain with specific tasks? Issues. So first we should search. We know the target. The target are the issues that include the desired extinguishers. So we should look up or browse for them. Something around that line. That should be one. So it's an issue, and then do something with the pathways of them. Like do some kind of annotation, trends, maybe correlation between them, something like that. I think that, yeah,
There's going to be some layer It's like a backwards How do you draw this? How do you draw this? I think it's this.
Okay, so does somebody want to describe like what data? Like, did anybody do a data transformation step in some way? Yeah.
I was thinking about, because you have like this complex graph, and maybe kind of do some sort of clustering algorithm where it's like, like the genes, if they were indicated as a mark, would be closer together. The shorter the path is between the two genes, and sort of do some sort of, so take a complex graph representation and try and code it using positioning.
Okay, yeah. So that's a little bit of an encoding choice to some degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking, because you either have samples that survive or didn't survive, so just to quickly compare them averaging, like the gene expression for.
Exactly. So like partitioning the data set into the samples that did show the effect and didn't show the effect is one first step here. And then the next step was like we have a lot of genes, but we also like know that this is differential expression in a particular pathway, and the pathway also defines a subset of genes. So we could even further subset that. And so here is like basically my task abstraction. So we have only some samples show the desired effect. So we derive two groups of samples, those that have and those that have not died. And then if we parse that statement, the difference between the samples is caused by differential expression, different activity of genes in a particular pathway. If you would like to understand which genes are likely to cause the difference. So first we identify the genes that are in the pathway. Then we compare the gene expression of the pathway genes between those two groups, and by doing that, by doing this comparison, we can identify these outliers, which genes behave differently in this pathway between those two groups. And then the second part of this is related to the pathway. She would also like to understand which genes are likely to cause a difference on what roles to play in the pathway. And this is really about understanding the environment of the pathway, right? Where is this node in the network? And so here is, you need now to locate the outliers that you've previously identified in that pathway, and from there on out, explore the topology to understand what those are. So does that make sense? And is that like clear how just like we've taken this complex problem with a lot of domain-specific lingo and broken it down into something where we don't have to mention gene expression necessarily, right? We're just talking about tables and graphs, and so we can actually break it down like this. So did anybody get to designing a visualization for that? Yeah, what's your visualization like?
So we thought you could kind of start with like a heat map. So like samples are on the x-axis and then all the genes are on the y. And then you can kind of have like their division of like the living on one side and the dead on the other. And then by clicking on like the vertical sample, then, or maybe like two samples, like a living sample and a dead sample, it would kind of like then bring up like two like network topology graphs of their expression and kind of highlight, and then you could even click like genes like going down on the y-axis to kind of highlight in the network where they're different.
Yeah, cool. So what you've done here is like either use interaction or use small multiples for the network faceting, and then you used you basically have identified like I have a tabular data set, so what is a good tabular visualization technique for that? And then you've partitioned it by died or didn't die, and so like you've used a lot of the techniques that we talked about recently. And that's very similar actually to my design. Did anybody come up with another design approach? So I'll just show like basically these are the kinds of questions that you could ask yourself when you talk about encoding design. So we have tabular data, we have, let's say, about 30 samples, that's what is specified, and in the pathway we could probably have about 30 genes. We want to compare groups and spot outliers. So one approach to deal with this data set would be to use dimensionality reduction and see what are the similar genes. But it doesn't really show us the raw data, it's not really great at comparing groups. We could use a scatterplot matrix, but 30 dimensions is a little bit too much for a scatterplot matrix, and therefore we have a scalability problem. We could try to use parallel coordinates, but again, for parallel coordinate, 30 dimensions is a lot, and you also would need to color for comparison. So we have choices of heat maps and bar charts, and those would actually work for this data of that scale. So we can say we have for heat maps, we have a spatial separation of groups, like those that died and those that didn't. And for bar charts, that works even better because we use position instead of color. 30 by 30 is still feasible for bar charts. It wouldn't be possible if I looked at like 1,500 genes, for example. Then we would have to use a heat map. But for 30 by 30, you can actually use a bar chart. And so this is actually a visualization technique that we designed. And so here you see like the data, whether they died or not. Low bars here means that they died. High bars here, it means that they didn't die. And then we show, like for a sequence of genes here, the expression data, and you can look at these correlations between those two groups. And then for the second part is, if we have a network of 30 genes, we want to explore the abstract tasks are explore topology, and to look up nodes. Our choices are three basic choices, and we'll talk more about this after fall break, are matrix layouts, adjacency matrices, tree maps, or node link diagrams. Matrix layouts don't really work well for topology tasks. It doesn't really work well for like exploring the environment of a network. Tree maps only work for trees and not for general graphs. So node link diagrams seem to be the only option, and we can compare it. We can combine this with a table using multiple views and highlighting between the two of them. So here we would have like essentially like a highlighted sequence of nodes that we could then extract and show in the table. And so I realized that this is a kind of a complex example, but this is like a real world example of how this domain characterization, task abstraction, encoding design works in practice, and I hope this is some guideline once you get to design your own visualizations. We have a couple of minutes left, but I'm not going to start the next section, and so let's just call it for today, and we'll see you guys on Thursday for the exam.
Alright, my man. Question for you. Yeah. For the first one, we have all these illustrations. Is all of one program, or do you have different start? All in one program, just run it, and like accuracy for 60%, accuracy, all of that is one program. So add that main program, add a comment like I didn't add run my Python file in this folder. So, wait, so do I need a script for that, or can I just say in the read script, just like play it? Yes. Yes, just run the program. And then the last one was, so I didn't set a seed initially. So every time you run it, it's just different. Do I need a seed? Well, you need a seed because you should have a seed because when you run a program, you would like to see the same something happening. But the freaking you have to change everything. Yeah, I have to go back and rerun. I mean, the code's already there, so I can just click play again. Does it matter what seed you use? No, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I know, man.
But this is actually like more about this.
The number of questions? Yes, I think so. Probably be part A, B, C.
Like, did he say 60 or 80 or 60?
So we can also be like the
flow of the one that is creating I wouldn't mind because the last case we had, I think, having the CD is important because we can actually like run your code and see that you have but you could also argue that I didn't use the CD, but these are the accuracies I'm getting. Yeah, I don't know. Let's go back. I'm in this here.
So, the question you always have to ask yourself to make that distinction is the Q scores also they are
So far, yes.
Yeah. I have questions about setting up the stratify tree layouts. I guess you got off that, right?
This is like a D3 question.
Yeah.
I think you should probably go to Sam. You might
So it's doing the sort, but it's not doing the update to the data. Yeah. And so you may be doing something like setting the attribute just the enter rather than updates. And that would cause it to like if you're sorting the data, please no enter. Right? Does that make sense? That's my guess is what's going on. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, stratify. It doesn't work. It's kind of like, I'm not sure.
There's the start files and like a web page on that.